Thank you, David, and welcome back, folks, from our short break. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Mr. Craig Miller of Viasat. He is the Vice President and Chief Technical Officer for Viasat Government Systems. He started at the University of Arizona, studying electrical engineering, particularly communications and signal processing. Pretty good preparation for a career in satellites, I'd imagine. And worked for a very old company to begin with, Hughes Aircraft. And it's always interesting to hear that name come up when we are in a modern space race, with our own versions of Howard Hughes, iconoclastic aviators and innovators. And then since then, he has been with Viasat in a long and illustrious career. Joining him will be Lieutenant General James Kevin McLaughlin, who is the former Vice Commander of U.S. Cybercom, has a truly illustrious career after having studied science at the Air Force Academy and then through Webster University Space Systems Engineering. He spent his time focused on enabling and innovating throughout the defense ecosystem. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, gentlemen. Thank you. I just see General McLaughlin has joined us, and we have Craig. So I will turn it over to you, Craig, to take us on forward. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the gracious introduction there. And thank you for inviting us to your chat today. We're looking forward to having a discussion about multi-domain operations and the role of industry and government in their collaboration with that. And so again, I'd like to thank our host for conducting the summit today. This is difficult to pull these together in these sort of virtual times. So again, thanks to everyone for pulling this together. I'm sincerely optimistic that next year when we do this conversation, we can all be in the room together and we can have a richer, deeper discussion, and we can share our insights and share our thoughts together with these issues. And of course, I'd like to thank our special guest today, Lieutenant General Kevin McLaughlin. And as Zahir introduced him, he's the former Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. He also has 37 years of experience in space and cyberspace with a focus on creating and leading large-scale, innovative global organizations. Kevin has unique strengths in managing strategic corporate cyber risk, complex organization strategic planning, policy development, and human capital development. As the founder and president of McLaughlin Global Associates, LLC, General McLaughlin serves as a corporate director and advisor to executives and corporate boards. He provides strategy formulation and implementation with an emphasis on the areas of space and cyberspace. He specializes in advising senior executives in the identification and mitigation of cyber-related strategic business risks as they exist across the entire enterprise and the mitigation of cyber risks in complex space systems. General McLaughlin's last active duty assignment was the Deputy Commander of the United States Cyber Command at Fort Meade. He served there from 2014 to 2017 in that role. He directed over 12,000 personnel and a budget of over $525 million to defend the nation's largest information network, provide offensive cyberspace options to commanders, and protect critical U.S. infrastructure from cyber attacks. Before joining Cyber Command, General McLaughlin led the 24th Air Force, the U.S. Air Force organization of 4,500 personnel that organized, trained, and equipped cyber defense forces to execute global cyberspace operations. Prior to his assignment at the 24th Air Force, General McLaughlin spent 30 years as a leader of large, complex, highly technical organizations associated with some of the world's most critical space infrastructure and operations, including 170 satellites for the national leadership, U.S. allied military and federal agencies, and the GPS constellation. He also served as the only active duty staff member on the Commission to Assess National Security and Space Management and Organization, also known as the Rumsfeld Space Commission. So clearly this rich, varied mix of cyber, space, and operational experience will give Lieutenant General McLaughlin a valuable perspective on how to bring MDO to fruition and how MDO and the traps and pitfalls and the opportunity to MDO, and how we can bring that to a real capability with the cooperation of the US government, our allied partners, and industry. So once again, thank you very much, Lieutenant General, for being with us today. I'm sincerely looking forward to the conversation today. I think it's going to be an exciting talk.
Thanks.
I'll start with a couple opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to the General here. Given the complexity of the modern battle space and the proliferation of commercial and government communication, sensing, Earth observation, and data processing and warehousing technologies, achieving true multi-domain operations will require a coordinated, concerted, collaborative effort among the US government, our coalition partners, and industry to ensure that the users of these very tactical and strategic systems have the ability to benefit from secure data processing, storage, distribution, and intelligence in machine time. A true MDO-enabled battle space will allow users on land, at sea, in the air to convert data to intelligence products and common operational pictures to provide actionable decision aids at the speed of relevance while defending against threats in cyberspace as well as land, sea, and air. To achieve this, we require interoperability among formerly stovepiped, non-interoperable systems. Systems like tactical data links that were in the past line of sight systems now need to become beyond line of sight systems. And we require the ability to store, tag, sort, and deliver mission critical data to the users that need it in a timely manner without creating information overload and without creating a system that our enemies can disrupt, degrade, or deny. So with that context, I'm going to turn it over to General McLaughlin for any opening remarks, and then we'll get into the discussion. So General, over to you.
Greg, thanks. You know, the broad topic of multi-domain operations has aspects that we could spend weeks talking about, and many of them have to do with changing strategic focus of our country, doctrine being written, ways of thinking about warfare that would not just exist inside a single theater of a combatant command, but would be trans-regional in focus and would exist in what we would typically call in pre-conflict states. So just in that alone, we could spend a few weeks talking about how the government and the Department of Defense are changing how they think about planning, conducting, and executing warfare in that area. That's not the focus that I would like to lead us down today. It's also, there's a lot of technology focus of how we do it. We might touch on that, but I'd like to touch on, as we get into it, a little bit more of what I think are even harder, and that are some of the transformational things that happen in how the government and industry, in particular, and our coalition partners, actually come together in a sort of an interdependent way, different than the traditional vendor-supplier relationship, but in a way that actually brings great power to the government's mission, including on the MDO side, but also leverages a part of the government or part of our country's resources and those of our close allies in a different way. And so I'm glad to answer any questions folks might have and talk about the other parts of it, but that's the area that I think today is upon us and in at least the world I live in, the most interesting.
Thank you, sir. And I appreciate the intro there. And one of the things you said sort of leads into one of the first topics for today's. So many have proposed the US government should pursue what we call a hybrid architecture that includes systems that are purpose-built for the US government, systems that are owned, operated by our allies and coalition partners, and commercial and/or industry-based solutions to create an MDO architecture. In your intro, you described about moving beyond the sort of vendor-supplier ConOps of how these systems are procured, both for the government-owned systems and the industry systems. Do you see any serious movement towards a hybrid approach like this? Or if not, what are the first steps we should take?
Sure. You know, with regard to the commercial side, I'll talk about the international partner side in a few minutes. I'm convinced there's a coming sea change with regard to how the US government in particular is going to use and rely on pure commercial services at a rate that we haven't in the past by a significant amount, but in place of government-owned and operated platforms that provide a similar service. I think there's evidence of that type of change all around us. Look at things like AWS supporting the intelligence community's C2S program, Air Force and Army efforts in the enterprise IT as a service arena, SpaceX launch activities to include manned space launch. Those are all things that there was a time not that long ago that people would have said that would never happen. We would never do that. Those missions are too important. I was a launch guy before, and the most sacred thing that was an inherently governmental activity was launching men and women into space. And then I watched SpaceX do that several months ago, and it was just an example. That change is coming. And so I think the question is, how are we going to manage it, and what are the reasons we would do it, and how might it work? Another reason that I think this is happening is the foundations for this type of change for things like MDO and inside the Department of Defense, they're being laid by the words of our senior leaders, like those such as, just listen to General Jay Raymond, who's the Chief of Space Operations, and other senior leaders as they talk about attributes they're looking for in their future enterprise, and a reliance on commercial capabilities and coalition capabilities is in their words. I will say though, like many major changes, this is so different than the norm of even how I grew up and how I thought about what the government was supposed to do, that there will be, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but it's just a big change typically has some frozen middle that doesn't embrace, or perhaps even doesn't really understand the change that's coming. I think that that exists today in this area. On the international side, I think there's a similar desire there. I think we've spent less time thinking about how coalition partners could play a fundamental interdependent role in what the U.S. brings. I saw some examples of how that could work when I was at U.S. Cyber Command, where we really fully integrated and depended on other countries bringing actual capabilities instead of us, and we did it as a team. And I was surprised at how even small countries were able to contribute well above what you would consider they could based on their size or their scale. And so I think that is a desired attribute in the future for MDO, is that we would bring our international partners along. But I do think I think the commercial services integration is more mature and a little further down the road within the government than really embracing the international side.
Yeah, I think you know, in the work that we've been doing over the years too, we see some of that change happening, and we see the government starting to embrace a wider variety of capabilities. Can you talk for a minute about why you think the sea change is coming and what is driving it? So why should the government be interested in using
that's
commercial capabilities and other capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say there are times where I talk about some of those folks in the middle of our large organizations. They ask me the same question: why would we do this? They look at me like, what, as if we should never do this. And so the question as into why is a great one. I think there's a number. I kind of think of four big ones. There's probably others, but one significant one is every government leader I've heard talk about this in the last 10 years has talked about the desire to have access in our government capabilities to the very latest commercial technology. And we do trips to Silicon Valley, we do trips to the Northeast, we meet with tech firms, but we never have really figured out how do we get that technology at speed into a traditional government program. It's just not doable. But if we were able to integrate commercial capabilities, such as the examples I gave before, there are others, what you really get is you're able to leverage that commercial tech investment of a large company in particular. That's an order of magnitude or more often than what government R&D budgets are going to sustain, or even traditional government industry players' IR&D budget. I mean, by a significant margin, that those commercial firms are putting significant money into the latest technology. And if you buy a service that has that technology embedded, you get access to that capability immediately. And so in many traditional programs that we're used to, you could pick your most advanced airplane or ship or even a satellite that is a traditional program. And we freeze the tech baseline years before the first capability is fielded, so that by the time you start operating, your technology is already significantly dated. And then you sustain that capability often over decades, and you're often many generations behind what state of the art would be. So I think that's a big one, the access to the latest commercial technology. I think it also allows what I think of as strategic agility. The government does not have to buy into. I mean, I spent my life operating and being part of an environment that I loved, but it was really created franchises that the government would operate. And the whole ecosystem was about producing, when I was the GPS squadron commander, I was part of a large environment that had been going for decades, where we owned this franchise of GPS satellites. We were responsible for every piece of it once it was fielded, and it created. I mean, it's a great program and it has a great legacy, and I'm very proud to have been part of it. But it does create an inertia to perpetuate itself in some cases. And I'm not proposing GPS is the area to outsource. I'm just giving you an example. But if you have a service approach, and you can actually stop buying the service that you have and buy a different one, and you're not throwing away a franchise, or even you're not really dealing with it in some way. So there's an agility that comes strategically for government leaders in bringing that approach forward. The third one is speed. If I go back to my GPS example, or really any franchise program for the government, you have these long timelines. I mean, there's the S&T timeline to develop the technology and mature it. There's the planning, programming, budgeting timeline that you've got to get into the right cycle. There's the development and production of the actual capability timelines to build it and test it and field it. And then you get to operate it. You get to really skip other than maybe budgeting for it, you get to skip a lot of those processes just to procure a service, because you're turning to a company that's already likely delivering that service in the commercial market, and they don't have to start over. And I would imagine if you went to look at things like the AWS experience with the intelligence community or other examples that I mentioned, you would see that play out in spades. The last thing I'll mention is cost. If you can procure a service and then the industry partners providing all the sort of end-to-end parts of the service, you can shed DoD infrastructure because you don't need military units to operate and sustain that franchise capability. When I was down at the 24th Air Force on the Air Force cyber component, I know you mentioned Harry Radke, some people on this line very, very familiar and more experienced than I in that environment. But we had hundreds of people, many hundreds of people these were units and squadrons and groups and parts of wings that operated and sustained our IT capability. They ran help desk. They made sure that the equipment was not only connected and turned on and operating, but they could go and do that, any place on the planet, and they did it very well. But we had to pay for the operations and maintenance of those units. The units weren't free. There was a significant line item in the budget, and we had to pay our most expensive costs today in the military are our people costs. And so if you buy a service, you can either shed that infrastructure and those people, or today, typically you would reinvest them into areas where you absolutely need to have military and government folks. And so I do think the apples to apples cost comparison, if you're looking at the cost of one approach versus the other, I think you would see a significant set of savings if for those areas where it's appropriate to bring in a commercial capability.
Thank you for that answer. That's really thought-provoking. As I listened to you lay that out, the thing that struck me in that answer is basically what you described is we're creating a market here where the US government can basically leverage a market of capabilities. And so that seems to be one of the key core elements of the transition you described, because in the previous sort of acquisition paradigm, there were market forces at play in the early stages of the acquisition. And then a winner or a couple of winners would be picked. And as you say, we'd sort of freeze the baseline and we'd operate those systems for many years. And of course, we upgrade them over time, and those capabilities improve over time. But it's less of a market situation where you have a lot of folks that are on the outside looking in. What you described is a true market. And that's one of the things that's made America successful over the centuries. And one of the advantages we've had over our peer adversaries historically is we have the power of the free market at our backs. And what you're describing is really leveraging the free market and taking the cutting edge that the free market develops and using it when it's appropriate. Obviously, there's situations where there needs to be purpose-built government capabilities, and the market doesn't provide some things. For example, Viasat doesn't build rad-hard satellites because it would decrease the capacity significantly and it would increase cost. But the government does need rad-hard satellites in some cases. But there's many examples as you walk down the line like that. And so, what do you think some of the primary barriers to implementing the market-based approach you described? Would you say they're technical, or they're cultural, or are there other barriers we have to overcome to unleash the market for the government?
Yeah, there's the barriers are technical and cultural, and you're exactly right. It would be unwise to throw out all of our government capabilities and replace them with commercially provided services. That's not my suggestion at all. I do think a significant set of barriers, though, that are, and maybe some of these are a barrier doesn't mean that it's not a warranted thing. It could mean it's a legitimate set of challenges to think through before you implement a new approach. But I think cultural barriers are significant. As I mentioned when I was talking about speed, where you begin to talk about all the sort of sets of processes that exist in the government, a community that does S&T, a community that does planning, programming, and budgeting, a community that does requirements, vetting and approval and validation, a community that requires, develops and produces. All of those are different groups of people, and any one of them could sort of not understand this approach. And so a big cultural, I think, challenge is really one. It's a senior leader challenge. It's one to where at some very senior level, there needs to be an agreement among peers that we are going to make a change, and it's going to be defined in a certain way, and then they lay out that set of expectations and measure and grade the folks underneath them in terms of, are they on board with the vision, and really do we have unity of effort towards some change? That's a hard thing to do in the government. It's a hard thing to do in a large company, but it is not going to bubble up from below. It is going to have to be defined and led and continually focused on by the leaders. Any big company that does such a change, often the very most senior corporate leaders, they only have that, they have a few things they really focus on in terms of they own, and sometimes driving change is something that is owned at the top. And I think this is one of the barriers, being cultural, is really only going to be solved by that. I do think there is a legitimate question about the line between what's inherently governmental as a function that needs to be done by a more traditional government capability and run by government people. And I don't know exactly what that line is today, but I would say that the line is way closer to commercial than many that I talk to believe that it is. I think people define at times inherently governmental in a way that, at least today, is just not accurate. And I gave a few examples. Managing our most sensitive data and databases that exist in the intelligence community probably would have been defined as the most inherently governmental in the world. Yet we now have this awesome partnership between AWS and the government to do that, where a commercial capability with the appropriate tweaks as required by the government is still being run and managed in a way that I think shows that was not an inherently governmental system, at least throughout its depth. And my example of launching men to the U.S. International Space Station, or humans, I guess it could be men and women. Again, another area that I think there would just be people that would say that would never have happened in just a commercial offering like what SpaceX did. And so I know there are some legal areas, of application of force, execution of warfighting operations that require, by law, a military person and the capability, probably things associated with aspects of our, our nuclear enterprise. I'm sure there are some where you absolutely, we need inherently governmental capabilities, but I do think those are legitimate questions to have. All I would say is, I think if you did a very careful examination, you would find there are common sense and practical and good ideas of how you integrate an MDO inside the broader enterprise, a range of capabilities, including a healthy dose of commercial and coalition. The last one I would just say is, and perhaps we could talk about that as a separate issue, but it's this notion about resiliency and the ability to operate in crisis and conflict. And so, and depending on how much time we have going forward, I think that's worthy of sort of a separate discussion, kind of all on its own.
Yeah, General, I think we are getting constrained for time, but I'm sort of keenly interested in your view on the threat. So I'd like to spend most of the last few minutes we have here talking about that. And so as we think about a transition to a hybrid sort of enterprise for MDO, there are serious threats that exist in space and cyber that could threaten this, but really all domains. But how do you view the addition of non-US government systems and assets in an MDO enterprise? Does that detract or add to space and cybersecurity in an MDO enterprise?
Yeah, so I think this is a fascinating part of this discussion, and that's as senior government leaders, and including those that are trying to field MDO capabilities, they are very aware of serious threats that exist to the U.S. and really in all domains, but especially in space and in cyberspace. And so we have a major focus on resiliency in those areas. But what I think is happening, that I would say a trend in the right direction, is in the last, I think, 4 to 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that, we've had, I think, an overly simplistic treatment of space resilience. We've really kind of pitted sort of these binary options against one another, legacy approach, like in space, legacy approaches that pit big geosynchronous, big juicy targets against proliferated LEO approaches to an approach as a sort of this binary kind of argument, or even a teed up a binary argument that these hardened, resilient military capabilities versus a unhardened, open commercial capability. And so I think in the recent past, that's sort of been, I think, not satisfying real treatment of the issue. I think there are some thoughtful leaders and some companies that are putting more sort of white papers and thought pieces out into the press, where they're really talking about a much more comprehensive approach to resilience, and that's one where really a whole variety of approaches are warranted. They're talking about things more like layered defense and defense in depth as a concept, both distributed and adaptive architectures that take advantage of our leadership role sort of in IT and technology. Things where these differentiated layers could include innovative systems that are all the way from US procured sort of traditional systems that might operate in a domain, US procured capabilities that might operate cross domain, but also coalition and commercial capabilities that would all sort of function in this defense, sort of this notion of providing an overall enterprise capability, but not giving the adversary a single place to shoot in terms of its offensive capability. And you kind of get resiliency through this notion of defense in depth. And I think if you think about end-to-end missions or portfolios that would be made up of all these various systems, then you actually get I think a much stronger type of resilience, one where the strengths of various capabilities, such as advanced technology from a commercial firm versus some unique set of things that a government procured system might offer, you get them both, and you can take advantage of both in a way that is more resilient. I do think we have. I know we're running out of time. I just would like to say one thing. I think it's one thing that people ask me is every commercial capability the same in terms of its inherent resilience? And the answer is no. I do think more and more companies, both public and private companies, are realizing their own inherent resilience to things like cyber attacks and threats are becoming more and more important to them and important to the government if they serve the government. And I do think we need to come up with some way of sort of understanding and assessing sort of the inherent resilience to approaches that the private sector would provide, so that if you're going to depend on it for some key government warfighting function, such as an MDO enterprise, you do have some understanding of what risk that system brings with it when it's incorporated into your overall approach.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating set of thoughts there, and I agree with your opening remarks. We could probably talk about that for weeks. I would love to dive into that and talk a little longer. The one point I want to think about a little bit, again, is, as you describe a sort of proliferated, varied system, the resilience benefits are obvious because there's not one threat to choke, there's not one target to shoot at. You do create, from a cyber perspective, you might create a greater attack surface where there's easier ways in, and I think there's going to have to be a change in paradigm in cyber defense. You can't rely on boundary defense in an enterprise like this because there's too many ways in, there's too much of an attack surface. And I think you hit on the key points of we have to have the threat intelligence and the situational intelligence so that we can make sort of adaptive decisions about these and create zero trust architectures where we're making informed decisions about users and mission data and how we choose to use or not use these networks. Do you have any additional thoughts on that matter and how we might get to an architecture like that?
I think in my brain, I always like to see the big bang, big change, the thing that changes the world from one state to another. I think the way you get to such an approach, instead of giving you a process, I would just say, by making more of a leadership principle, is that you do two things. One is the senior leaders set that guide star. They set the vision. Here is where we're headed, and and generate a coherence towards that. But at the same time, a realistic view that this is an incremental set of steps towards it. And as long as you know where you're going, you'll know whether steps you're taking in some realistic way, whether it's bound by how fast you can spend money or just the rate of change that the broad system enterprise can take. But you need kind of both. And I'd say be realistic about how the rate of change that we can make towards it, but don't take steps that are actually headed 180 degrees away from the goal that you're trying to get to. I know that maybe is too simplistic to the question you're answering, but I think sometimes we skip some of these leadership principles that we need to put in place and get focused and fall in love with the process or some new widget. And I'd like to stick at the top level what we ought to do so that we are always headed towards the broader goal that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think that you can't achieve anything hard without having a clear, coherent vision and leadership that gives a clear set of steps of how to get there, and a talented organization that wants to sort of walk, crawl, run to get there. And I think that's how we'll achieve something like this, is we have to take baby steps and make incremental improvements to show we can get there. But we need the leadership, we need the thought leadership, and we need that vision set and followed to really get there. And I think this is somewhere we can get.
Great, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure the mechanics of how this works. If we turn this over for questions to the group, I don't see any on the chat, but I don't know if there's any questions. If there are, we can answer a couple. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to the general for some closing remarks.
I think, Craig, perhaps you could turn it back over to General McLaughlin for his closing remarks, sir.
Well, I just, I appreciate being invited to do this. It's great. The topic is important, and your interest is important, not just to learn and get smarter on something like this, but to figure out what role each of you in the place that you are might play in helping us get to this future state, which I think is essential. I think we will get there. Those who don't think we will, I say you're just going to die tired, that we are going to get there. It's just going to be difficult. And I see some names on here, Lee Levy and Bob Shea, and you mentioned Harry Radegui. I see some old bosses and leaders that I know have done that in the past, and probably could call me on the phone and spend about 30 minutes correcting half the stuff that I just said. But I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to seeing y'all out there, maybe solving one of these problems together. Thanks.
Thank you again, General McLaughlin. You've been fantastic. I think you've really provided some food for thought here, and even more importantly, some very concrete ways we can attack some of these problems. So thank you for providing your insight and your experience, and I look forward to working with you to try to solve some of these problems too in the future. And thank you again to Z and the conference organizers. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. David, I'm going to turn over to you briefly.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. I want to thank Craig. I want to thank the general. Fantastic. We appreciate it. It's an honor to have you. And I appreciate the words of encouragement. The point that the general made, saying you're going to die tired if you don't think we're going to do this, because it's going to happen. So that's really music to our ears. Appreciate you very much.